Good evening, everyone. It's Inappropriate Characters.
Hello, this is Inappropriate Characters, and this is the RPG Pundit talking to you, the final boss at Internet Shitlords. I'm here with Venger and Grim Jim, and we're talking about a number of different subjects today. As you can see, Grim Jim has dressed himself up for on account of this is going to be basically our Halloween episode, since because of various programming concerns, we're not able to get back together again, I think, until next month. So this is it. This is our October episode. And so he's dressed up in a suitably Halloween outfit, and I'm a disembodied ghost, which means that Venger, the High Priest of Cthulhu, is the least Halloweeny of the three of us. That's true, I am. He's also the only American. He's the only one who lives in a country where they actually have Halloween as a holiday.
Wait, the rest of the world doesn't have Halloween?
Not to the extent that you do.
Okay.
I mean, in recent years, in like Europe and in Latin America, it's become kind of popularized a little bit because of TV shows and movies from the US that have Halloween in it. And so kids see that and they want to do Halloween. But it isn't a traditional holiday. It's a traditional American holiday. It's not from other countries, really.
So we have house parties and school discos and things like that, but trick-or-treating is pretty frowned on.
So I thought that all other countries in the world were just like a suburb of America. Is that not true?
That's what most Americans think. But before we go back to talking we're going to talk a bit about horror gaming in the context of RPGs and all that, and Halloween themed. But first, I thought we should make a tribute to Greg Stafford, who most of you watching this probably are sufficiently tapped into the RPG scene to have seen tribute posts about the fact that he passed away. Greg Stafford was a game designer, an incredibly influential game designer, who was the main designer behind RuneQuest and Pendragon, which is one of my favorite games. He also was involved, because he was in Chaosium, with Call of Cthulhu, which is also ties into our Halloween theme. Besides that, Greg Stafford was a mystic and a kind of a magician, sort of like myself and Venger. He died the way I'm sure that he might have enjoyed dying, which was in his sweat lodge, doing no doubt something that was creating a mystical experience for him. And I wanted to mention him because maybe not to the same extent as Eric Wujik, who was kind of my mentor in RPGs and who I had a lengthy correspondence with. Greg Stafford was another guy that had a big influence on my RPG career, not just as a kind of a gamer, but as from the point of view of design. I was a big fan of Pendragon, especially with the 4th edition of Pendragon. I was lucky enough to pick up the 4th edition book and the Great Pendragon campaign book, which later on became extremely rare. But it's probably one of the greatest campaign books. It's huge. It's an enormous book. One of the greatest that was ever made. And it was very, very influential for me in terms of my eventual development of Dark Albion, because it taught me a lot of lessons about how to use material out of folklore, how to incorporate legend into RPG setting, and especially the matter of like the timeline, right? Most RPG setting books, what they have is this huge chapter on everything that happened before the PCs show up in the setting, right? Starting sometimes like 10,000 years ago or whatever, everything that happened up to the current date. And then it kind of just says, well, then good luck after that, right? And the Great Pendragon campaign was actually done the opposite way around, right? It tells you a little bit about the past, but then what it presents you with is very detailed timeline of the future of the next 80 years of the campaign, year by year, of events that happen and things that are adventure hooks and stuff like that provides a step-by-step way for you to keep developing forward the timeline in your campaign in a way that is connected, in his case, obviously, to the Arthurian legend, but that was also still open enough for it to be adapted to whatever the PCs wanted to be doing. And that was kind of my inspiration for the Dark Albion main book. This is Cults of Chaos here, but anyways, in the main book, I have a short historical chapter and then a fairly long timeline year by year of all the events of the Rose War. And that I don't think that it would be a bad thing to say that I owe that directly to Greg Stafford and his genius in designing that. In general, I think he was a very big influence in terms of kind of putting in a more folkloric, a more archetypal perspective into RPG settings. The influences, maybe along with M.A.R. Barker, who did Tekkamel, but Tekkamel is very weird, whereas Stafford was designing directly to incorporate kind of the Jungian elements of archetype in his world design and in how he ran his settings. And I think that in a way you could say was adding a lot of sophistication to setting design that I think influenced a ton of people, because maybe not that many people. I mean, RuneQuest was a popular game in its time, but maybe not as many people played that as played D&D. But a ton of game designers either looked at RuneQuest or at Pendragon and used that in some way to influence other stuff that they made. Anyway, that's what I have to say about Stafford. I'm sure that, like I said, he went out like I'm sure he would have wanted, and I had some conversations with him over email on a few occasions. He was a great guy. I don't know if how much he influenced you guys, Grim or Venger, but if you want to add something, this would be the time, I guess.
Well, see, RuneQuest is the main thing that people associate with him, and when RuneQuest was brought to the UK, at least for part of its history, it was published by Games Workshop back when they still did role-playing games, but they didn't do the RuneQuest setting exactly. They had their own Romano-Celtic Arthurian type background. So when I experienced RuneQuest, I didn't really experience it the way he wanted it to be done. I've bought a lot of RuneQuest material over the years to read, but I've never actually gotten to play in Glorantha at all, really. So yeah, I think he was a designer's designer, and that's no bad thing. And I think he showed that there was more scope that you could enter into without necessarily having to be pretentious in terms of the spirituality of game worlds and undermining the idea that all monsters are necessarily bad and so on. I mean, we're all used to that now. Everyone wants shades of grey in their game worlds, and maybe we're seeing a bit of backlash to that. But he was one of the first to really explore that whole aspect. So yeah, it's a big loss.
Venger, anything? Did he influence?
I never played RuneQuest or Pendragon. I never really was that into like taking direct inspiration from European history. I liked Excalibur and movies like that growing up, but when it came to gaming, kind of the weirder and darker the better. Dark Sun was more my cup of tea, I guess, than something like RuneQuest or Pendragon or anything like that. But I played a lot of Call of Cthulhu, and since he
and he did have a part to play in Call of Cthulhu. It wasn't him; it was more Sandy Peterson, I think. But Stafford certainly had an influence there. Yeah.
So I mean, just for that alone, that's awesome. Probably after D&D, I'd say Call of Cthulhu was my main game in the late 80s and early 90s. So definitely cool there. I was reading what you wrote before and then listening. Is there anything that when you guys talked that he wrote about in his emails, any kind of occult lore or any special thing that he was into, or any special pearl of wisdom or forbidden esoteric knowledge that he imparted that you could share with us, or really anything?
Well,
I'd be curious to know, like,
yeah, my email conversations with Stafford were, I think around they were before I came to Uruguay first. So the first ones were, I think, around 2001, 2002 maybe, and then if I'm remembering correctly, and then there was another couple of emails that we exchanged in 2007 or 8, somewhere around there, and so part of them were practical because I was trying to get some of his books, so it was like that was the intro. Then we chatted a bit about we talked a bit about Pendragon, and we talked a bit about Arthurian legend, I think, and we had some conversation. He was kind of I don't know exactly what he would have defined himself as in terms of mysticism. I think he was in some ways very Jungian. I don't know if he would have used that word, but he was very big into this kind of shamanism, but not necessarily in the literal sense of not necessarily Native American, though he did have a sweat lodge, but in the sense of like the universal shamanism, right? The sort of Merkelian stuff, which I'm also quite acquainted with, and he was very, very into the value of myth and legend, obviously, as symbolism of spiritual transformation. I'm trying to remember. I think I'd have to look up see if I still have these emails, but I think we talked a bit about the kind of mystical underpinnings of the elements of the Grail quest and stuff like that, and the Fisher King, which is always a very rich metaphorical sort of element of Western esotericism, right? And he, just to say, Venture, that I know that you're thinking of a different kind of weird, but if you look at the medieval myths and legends about the elf stories and the fairy realm and stuff like that, like, in a way, a lot of that stuff has been Baudelarized from the 19th century onwards. And so it looks as though a lot of European mythology is a lot more generic and tame than it really was, right? And I think that if you ever took a serious look at the actual medieval sources of these legends and these stories, and especially some of the myths inspired by Celtic or Germanic paganism, not necessarily actual pagan myths, because most of those don't.
Oh, he's gone quiet.
Finally. I'm kidding.
Maybe he'll come back in a sec.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, he definitely has a point. I'm sure a lot of the Germanic and Scandinavian stuff probably influenced Tolkien, and that's a whole other like medieval Europe.
Yeah, Tolkien drew a lot from Finnish folklore. One of the Elven languages is essentially Finnish with the file numbers, it's sort of scrubbed out. So yeah, but he was doing that through a Christian lens, I think, not to the extent that a lot of people seem to think, but still. Oh, we've lost Pundit completely. Hopefully he'll log back in a second.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll do that.
Oh,
here he is.
Are you back?
Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
Yeah, can kind of hear you.
All right, just give me a sec.
Okay.
All right. Technical difficulties. Please hold.
How about now?
Yeah.
Am I good? All right.
Yeah.
Jeez, I don't know what happened. I don't know when I got cut off, but I was the last thing I was saying was answering a question about from one of the people in the chat, where I was saying that that somebody asked me if there was going to be more material for Dark Albion, and I wanted to point out that my current PDF series, RPG Pundit Presents, about half of the stuff in there is material for Dark Albion, including adventures and stuff like that. So do a search for RPG Pundit Presents. You'll probably find it there. Yeah, sorry I got cut off. I don't know what happened there, really. It just turned off for no reason I can understand. But let's move on. The next topic, we're going to get into the Halloween subject of things, and that's horror in RPGs and RPG gaming. And I guess our weird masked goblin of the night should take over from here. Go ahead.
Don't say Goblin. Everyone's been watching Goblin Slayer. They'll be smashing their screens. So, horror gaming. I think it is possibly the second most difficult thing to get right in gaming after comedy. And for a lot of the same reasons, I think. When you're playing at the table, you're playing at an abstraction. Immersion's always the goal, but it's difficult, and I think it's especially difficult when it comes to horror, because a whole bunch of different horror tropes just don't really work at the tabletop. You can't jump scare someone. You can't. Well, you can pick off players one after another, but then they're sat around with nothing to do while the surviving players continue to play. Yeah, that's difficult. You're relying on people's imaginations and so on, rather than necessarily like raw graphics or whatever. You can play with lighting, you can play with music, you can do things to enhance the mood, but it's still a really difficult thing to get into. I think some ways you can go about it are things that you might not necessarily consider to be horror. I mean, Cthulhu is massively successful in part because it's not really a horror game in a lot of ways. There's this existential dread, I suppose, and the worrying about the things that are out there. But the main thrust of the game is investigative. You're finding out what's going on. You're decoding texts. You're weighing up how much of your sanity you want to risk. There's very little visceral, direct horror in it. If you want to go the splatterpunk route, that is a way you can go. And using your descriptions, if you're really graphic and disgusting, you can elicit a response from your players. But that's generally a bit cheap as a way to go about it. I've found the best way that I've encountered to get horror to work in tabletop is to take it really slowly, get people invested in their characters and their situation, and then slowly undermine it and bring in the horror elements very slowly. And that really amps up the sense of dread, and it makes people invested in their characters and not want anything bad to happen to them. So that's the approach that I've found that works. Other things, I mean, it depends how you define horror, and defining any genre is tricky. I mean, if you look at the Walking Dead series, how much of that is actually horror? How much of it is a survival situation that just happens to have a horrific aspect to it? So you can play things, you can play around with the genre in ways that aren't necessarily directly horror but have horror elements, and you can bring horror into your other games. You know, you can bring it into your approach to dungeons or whatever else. So I guess that's kind of sketched out the kind of conversation space, I suppose, to talk about it. But yeah, I think it's a really difficult thing to do. I've just kind of barely sketched out my tips for how to go about it. What about you guys? You got any tips or ideas for people?
Do you want to go first, Pundit, or do you want me to?
Well, I've been monopolizing the conversation, so you can go ahead first.
Okay. Yeah, kind of what Jim said about starting slow. I think that's a good technique. I like that in movies a lot, where it's not just like trying to hit you over the head from the get-go. It just kind of like gets you involved in the story, gets you immersed in like, oh, this is the real world. And then it slowly, turns it on itself and like, oh my God, you're in a nightmare situation. But also I would say to that, sprinkling little seeds or breadcrumbs or whatever, just little nods to the horror genre along the way. Like, let's say if you want to make a dungeon crawl scarier, you can have, and a lot of these are just maybe cliches that we've seen, hundreds of times, but you just put a little different spin on it, and then you get something new. Like when the adventurers first get to the gates, the dungeon itself, maybe there's a raven or something like that looks at them queerly. And then when they get to the dungeon, they see like the guy's, they take a couple steps in, they see like a severed hand. It's all bloody. Maybe it's recent and fresh. And then as they explore the corridors, they hear disembodied moaning and maybe some screams. And, every 5 or 10 minutes, there's just like little something. And maybe you go even further back, like when you're finding out about the dungeon in the village before they even start out. There's the stereotypical drunk in the tavern who, when he's had a few too many, starts going on about the weird things that have been seen. And Lovecraft did that too. He just alone on their own. Those little things don't add up to much. But when you have like a dozen, 15, 20 different like little tiny unique bits that are sprinkled throughout a 2, 3, 4 hour game, it can be really effective. And it can kind of draw people in slowly. It's like turning up the heat. Like you don't throw a frog in to boiling water because they'll just jump out. But if you put them in, I think that's the metaphor of the frog. And you slowly turn up the heat degree by degree, then he kind of doesn't notice. And all of a sudden he's in boiling water. And that's kind of what I like to do with my scary horror scenarios. And by the end, I think it has a very big impact. I think people are like more afraid that they're going to die or something worse would happen than their character's death. And that's kind of the key. You want people to get scared. You want people to identify with their characters, and they're scared because their character is scared in the scenario. That's the goal. So.
Okay. So I'm gonna start by saying that if you're talking about horror as a genre, you have to look at it compared to, I guess, horror in film and books, but mostly in TV, because that seems to be the inspiration these days. And if you think about that, the typical horror movie or TV show is not really something that is terrifying all the time, right? And in fact, most of the times, it's not really terrifying to the viewer. It's exciting for the viewer to watch it, right? So the viewer is looking at this show and they're thinking it's funny or it's entertaining, or sometimes once in a while you get these moments where you get like spooked, right? When I don't know, they're suddenly the clown with the axe bursts out of the closet or something like that, right? So for the most part, we have to remember that when you're watching a TV show, a horror TV show, a horror movie, you're not scared all the time. In fact, you're rarely really scared at all. You're like, what you're looking for is an interesting adventure that has elements that would scare you if you were actually in it, right? And once in a while, you get these like truly majestic horror stories or movies or shows that manage to create this profound sort of sense of immersion, where you like end up somehow really relating to the characters there. And so when they get terrified or they get existential dread, you do as well. And this is something that is kind of, I think, key in if you're trying to actually convey real horror in an RPG game is that what it really depends on is not so much, you know, how spooky you make your monsters, right? You can make your monsters unbelievably scary, or you can make a situation really scary. But if the players aren't actually feeling a deep sense of connection to their characters, if they're not immersing in the setting, then they don't really, they're not really going to feel fear for themselves. They might be like, oh, this is bad news for my character, right? So I think some of the most scary moments that I've had DMing in games has been usually in games that were not intentionally horror themed games, right? Like if I'm running a horror themed game, like, I don't know, Call of Cthulhu or Beyond the Supernatural, there might be moments where there's something like really, you know, that squicks people out, so to say, right? That it's like, you know, really disturbing, and they'll be like, ooh, right? But they're not going to be scared. But really, most of the, if I think back at the times when like my players felt literal fear, it's usually in a game that's been a really long campaign, that they're really into their characters, right? And it's usually some kind of a fantasy game or something like that. And they get into some situation that is somehow either terrifying in the sense of, you know, fear of death, right? Like, you know, they go into some dungeon and there's, you know, these zombie horrors or something. And like when there's a very sudden turnaround where they think that everything is fine, and then suddenly something gets triggered and they're all in mortal fear for their characters' lives. Or it's been in stuff where they get some kind of a sense of existential horror about something that's been happening in the background of the campaign, and that actually everything they thought they knew about their world or their characters or whatever is actually falling apart around them, right? So I think it's very hard to get that sort of direct fear for the characters by doing like a one shot of any game like Call of Cthulhu or whatever. But you don't necessarily need that to be, if what you're doing is, if you want to play a horror game, a horror one shot or a horror campaign or whatever, that doesn't need to happen. And it doesn't, especially doesn't need to happen right from the beginning. You need a buildup, right? So this is what made some of the really great Call of Cthulhu campaigns, like the classic stuff like Mass of Nyarlathotep or the, you know, Beyond the Mountains of Madness, Horror on the Orient Express. If you look at them textually, there's a really, really slow buildup, right? Like the characters begin in a situation that doesn't have any supernatural elements. That they, you know, it starts out almost like a pulp noir detective drama or something. They're trying to find somebody who got lost, or they're doing something else, or, you know, in the case of Mountains of Madness, they're going on an expedition to the Antarctic, and you have to do a lot of buildup of, you know, how do you survive in the Antarctic, and just like this stuff that has nothing supernatural in it. Probably one of the best horror miniseries that I saw recently was ironically called The Horror, which was this 10-part miniseries that I don't know whether it was Netflix or something else, but it's basically the story of the Franklin expedition that tried to get across the Northwest Passage, got stuck in the ice, and they all died, right? And it does a twist about that there's this supernatural element. But it's a fantastic miniseries because it starts with building up a lot of really, really practical stuff about these historical characters that they used, of, you know, how they were navigating, what life on the ship was like, you know, and then when they get stuck in the ice and how they're trying to fight against nature. And it's this big fight against nature until like nature takes on this supernatural element of wanting to kill them, right? And I think that's kind of the right formula for creating that sort of real dread. But it requires a buildup. You can't just dive into it and expect that the characters are going to be affected by that.
I think it's oh, go on.
Okay, I'll just do it real quick. So I just wanted to interject the kind of devil's advocate, because it's not easy to do. I'm not saying that it's like a snap, but it's definitely doable to get in there and establish feelings of horror and dread and just weird unease, disturbingness. I mean, if you look at the Twilight Zone, in 25 minutes, they were able to take an audience that had probably just been watching like Leave It to Beaver or Gunsmoke or something like that. And then within that 25 minutes, get the audience to a place where they were feeling genuine fear or horror or unease, just a combination of the weirdness and, the disturbing things that the Twilight Zone would show. And even your example with the massive Nile epithet, it's true. There wasn't like deep dive supernatural stuff going on right away. But on the other hand, the action does kind of take place. Like you said, it is kind of pulp because, this guy gets murdered, but still it's very obvious that it's, some sort of occult murder or cult murder or both. And I would just caution people, don't wait too long, or don't immerse yourself in the ordinary for, I would say, not more than like 45 minutes before you get to something juicy, or you get to something where there's some real action or some real horror or, something visceral. Because a role-playing game, just sitting there listening, or even taking little innocuous actions, it can take a long time. It feels long. And I think some game masters fall into the trap of, wanting to set things up for the horror later. And the first 2 or 3 hours of the session is just like a complete bore, or it's just too dry. It's too, too ordinary. Sure, you need a little bit of that. You can't just like wham bam and like, oh, all of a sudden, yeah, you're sitting there reading and yeah, the clown with the axe like jumps out of the closet or something like that. But on the other hand, don't wait too long. Don't, bore your players into a stupor and then be like, and then the horror happens like 15 minutes before the game is supposed to be over. Because, by then it's too late and you bored the shit out of everybody, for the last 3 hours. And now, who knows? Who knows what's going on in their mind? They've been drifting off for the last 20, 40 minutes. And now they're thinking about, their day tomorrow, or what they're going to say to their wife when, they get home and she yells at them. Stuff like that.
Right.
Not going from personal experience. I'm just saying.
Right. If I can interject, I wanted to make a correction. The miniseries I was talking about was actually called The Terror. One of the people in our chat corrected me on that. For some reason, well, we all know the reason, a lot of drugs. I had
horror,
misremembered the name. Yeah, I misremembered the name. It's called The Terror. It's an excellent miniseries. I think in regards to what you're saying, Benjer, obviously you can't go 0, 0, 0, 0, and then suddenly massive terror, right? And one of the typical techniques of writing horror, which I think also applies to DMing horror, is that instead of just kind of diving right into sudden horror and expecting that, because that's like just suddenly, okay, you're there and now there's zombies, right? That's more of an action element than actual, terror plot, right? And in all the really good horror literature, what you get is first you start with the mundane, and then you begin with little details that seem at first explicable but out of place, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more weird, and then suddenly there's something you absolutely cannot explain in a mundane sense, and then it starts to build into, like, from that point you can have a sudden introduction of the real menace of whatever's going on, right? And the horrifying realization of whatever, right?
That helps with the suspension of disbelief. Yeah, if you go from 0 to 60, people are like, it throws them off and they don't really believe it. You want people to believe this could happen, and like Lovecraft, be like, oh, this is odd, but understandable. As you were saying, you can explain it away. And then, so you see it all the way along, and then what seemed impossible from minute 1, and now a minute 59 or 60 now seems entirely possible. In fact, likely. So, yeah.
So to just kind of wrap this up then, I think part of the reason horror is so difficult to get right in a role-playing game is because there's a tension between some of the central conventions of horror and some of the central conventions of role-playing. Role-playing is about empowering people, playing their characters, choosing their actions.
Right.
And horror is often about taking that away from people. Yeah, terror, horror, madness, the unassailableness of the creature or the force or whatever it is. And those two things are just in so much tension, it's hard to strike the right balance.
Mm-hmm.
So just one quick thing. One really effective thing I did for a horror game once was really simple. They were spelunkers exploring caves. This was before all those. There was just like 2 or 3 films on that same kind of theme came out, but this was before that. And there were these subhuman things down there that were tracking them and would occasionally attack them. So all I did was I started gently drumming my fingers against the underside of the table to be like the oncoming drums of these things communicating by smacking rocks against the walls. And the players started whispering to each other so that they could hear when the finger drumming sooner, and they knew it was coming, and it created this real sense of urgency and fright and preparation. Sometimes it's just something as simple as that can really change the character of a whole session.
Yeah.
Lighting too, which is, I just thought of it, 5-10 minutes ago, like, oh wait, I'm the only one with, or not the only one, I guess. Yeah, Pundit has the lights on. But I was like, you know what, if I turn the light off, it would become like 2% scarier.
Yeah. You can get those
sometimes you just need the right lighting, and then
yeah, you can get those color change panels and bulbs and things that you run off an app on your phone pretty cheap now, and that can be surprisingly effective. But we should probably move on. Venja, I think it's your topic next.
Okay.
Yeah. OSR.
Yeah, the OSR, the old school Renaissance. So yeah, just kind of a cluster of things that I want to talk about with that. The OSR is kind of hopping again. Last month or the last couple of weeks, it was kind of under fire, and with people railing against Tenkar and the usual suspects like RPG Pundit, myself. I don't know if anyone gave you a hard time, Grim.
No more than usual.
Okay, and then that kind of died away, and then we heard about G Plus closing down. And me being, the lazy, wait till the last minute person I am, I probably would have waited till June of next year and then found a different platform. But everybody was just like, the sky is falling, we'll run for the hills. And so some people mentioned MeWe, and some other people got on board and started setting that up. I know Pundit was big on Minds.com. That social networking place. But as per usual, no one listened to Pundit. And everyone's a MeWe.
That's not true. The Minds.com has had a huge influx, maybe not as much as MeWe for now, but I'm betting that MeWe is people are going to run into some serious problems with it, especially publishers, for reasons I've already explained. But
I set the Minds.com account too, but
there's a number of new groups that have formed on Minds.com for role playing, including an OSR Minds group, and Grimm's role playing Minds group has got well over 200 members now.
Yeah, we need more though.
I only have a limited amount of time this week, but
get on Minds.
This coming week, that will be one of my priorities, is to get on Minds.com and create an account and then go check that out. But until then, I am on MeWe, and I set up a Corthalis Publishing group on MeWe as well for anyone that wants to join that. But yeah, that's one of the reasons. A lot of people are talking about the OSR more and what it means to them. And I realized, and I blogged about this the other day, that it's been defined before, but not a lot of people talk about why it came, not how, but why is there an OSR? And for me, it's because when I was role playing in the 2000s, I realized that I was having a lot less fun than in the 80s and early 90s when I was playing as a youth. And in that time, I wondered, like, is it me? Is it because I was just more into that kind of thing when I was younger, when I was in junior high and high school and even grade school? Or is it because of the rules? Is it because role playing has kind of changed? Play styles have changed, rules and systems have changed, just a different gaming culture. And I couldn't have known without trying, OSR type games, either old games from the 70s and 80s or some of the retro clones back then or now. And yep, sure enough, it was like D&D 4th edition, especially, and even 3rd edition and games like that really made me question whether I even wanted to continue role playing, because it's not an easy thing. It takes a little bit of work to get things going, to create up games and to run games. If you're the game master, you have to put in a fair amount of work. You don't just show up and play. And like many of us, you go back to your roots of how games were played back then, and you realize, oh yeah, this is what I've been missing. This is a lot of fun. This is a lot better than what I was doing. So that's kind of my experience. And a lot of people have seen Zach's post where he's asking people to, answer questions about the OSR. I know he very, very briefly mentioned the pundit. And
oh, really? What did he say?
He was listing the other people, and like the things they had done. And then at the very end, he was like, oh yeah, and then there's the RPG pundit. And he's done ... And then he just went on to a new paragraph where he was bitching about Alexander Macros being a douche or something like that, which he's not.
Remember, Zach is a piece of shit, right? Who took money from not directly from Macros, but from the company that Macros was running at the time, to do his little video series at a time that Zach desperately needed money, from what I understand. Not really because of him. His girlfriend was ill, and I mean, that's understandable. But then for entirely political reasons, he turned on Macros, denounced him, and basically never completed the project that he was paid to do. Right. So he's kind of garbage for saying this.
And he didn't mention me at all. I don't know if that's because he's blocked me and he doesn't like me for whatever reason. I mean, I remember back when I barely knew the guy, and he jumps in on one of my threads and starts ripping on how to game master like a fucking boss just because of the title. And I'm like, so then we get into this. This is before I really knew who he truly was. We got into this argument where we were like ripping on each other a little bit. And I kept like ripping on him more. And then he was just like taking it. And then I felt bad and I just stopped. And then later I was just like, you know what? You obviously have an opinion on it based on the title. Why don't you, how about I give you a PDF and you can read it? And, I'd seen him review things before. Like, maybe you could review it or something like that. And he's just like, well, you probably wouldn't appreciate the review I would give it. I'm like, well, you haven't even tried it yet. And he just was like, didn't even want to try. Just totally judged the book by not even the cover, but just the title. And just, I don't know what idea he had about it, but he was just adamant that whatever I was doing was just like the opposite of what he was doing, and it was garbage. And So I tried to smooth things over later, and that worked for a short amount of time, and then I got on this bad list again, and who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't get him.
Yeah.
It's weird how
So there's a lot of people talking about the history of the OSR, because not only him, but other people with this, blogging these questions. And, they picked the most popular ones, probably, stuff by Lamentations of Flame Princess or Zach, and some other big names. But I haven't seen anything about me, which is fine. I haven't seen anything about the pundits. I haven't seen anything about Jim. I haven't seen. Well,
remember, it's a very biased sample because Zach, has sent it to his fanboys, right? So of course they're going to.
It's biased.
They're going to be talking about his product.
Yeah,
it's broken out of there a bit. I mean, I did the questionnaire on my blog. I don't know. I don't consider myself particularly an OSR guy because I didn't grow up with D&D. That wasn't what I started playing with. So what I found valuable about the OSR is it's kind of given me the vicarious experience of other people's nostalgia. And it's really helped me understand people's affection for the old D&D books and things in a way that I couldn't because I didn't play D&D until I was about 4 or 5 years into my role-playing career, if you like. So that's why I found it valuable. But I don't know. I've written some OSR-oriented stuff, and I appreciate the DIY punk aesthetic behind it all. And the fact that
traditional, right? You're not into, off the beaten track story games, and
I love both. I love both. I love traditional games, and I love indie games. I'm always interested in mechanics, and whatever game is flavor of the month. I want to go and tear it apart and build it into my next Frankenstein game. So I'm kind of in the middle on the whole thing. I don't hate story games. I don't love them. I don't hate traditional games.
Do you read them? Obviously,
yeah.
Do you read them as well?
Depends. Some of them take my fancy. Some indie games. I cannot get on with any of the Powered by the Apocalypse games. I've just got some kind of block. I keep trying because I keep thinking I must be missing something because so many people love these games. But I just can't get on with them. I try and I try and I try, thinking that eventually it's going to click, but it just doesn't work for me. But OSR games, I can understand.
They're
crap. So I don't know. I mean, I read it. Seems like it's not for me, but I don't know until I've played it or I've tried to run it, and I just haven't had the opportunity. So I'm still waiting.
You're not missing much.
Okay.
The OSR thing. Let me talk. The OSR thing in G+ is weird because most people think of Google+ as being a ghost town, but for role players, it's actually got a really vibrant and active community. So I do hope that people will move off onto other platforms and keep some of that going because it is really valuable.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's two ways that this can go, right? Like either the end of G+ would mean the kind of the falling apart of that centralized community of the OSR, and that would be bad, or that actually the end of G+ will mean that the OSR will move into a number of different venues, and that could be good because G+, because of the platform it was in, and that it wasn't a well-known platform, like it had a ton, you're right, it had a ton of gamers on it, but it also had a ton of gamers that had never heard about that and had no connection to it, right? So the OSR moving into other social media might help to draw new people into the OSR that would never have found it if it stayed on G+. And I mean, we're talking about Minds and about MeWe and stuff like that. Yeah. But to give another example, if you look at Twitter, in the last 6 months or so, Twitter went from a place that had very little real conversation about RPGs to a place where, you know, there's huge amounts of posting mainly about D&D, mostly about D&D 5th edition, but it's huge, right? Like there's tons of posts there and all kinds of stuff happening there. But there wasn't as much stuff happening related to the OSR because the OSR people were still on G+, right? So as good as I think it's going to be to see the OSR moving into stuff like Minds or into stuff like MeWe, there's also, I think, a big chance there for OSR people to post more, like I have been for quite some time now, about the OSR on Twitter. And there's this huge audience on Twitter of D&D fans who are fans mostly of 5th edition, a lot of whom started with 5th edition and don't really know anything about old school gaming, to be able to kind of discover that part of it and draw into it, right? On my channel, you know, I mostly, my YouTube channel, I mostly do rants about, you know, this D&D gate and the state, the politicized state of D&D 5th edition. But in some ways, I think one of the most important videos I've done on my channel so far was one that was very apolitical, which was kind of an introduction to the OSR and why people who play 5th edition should look at the OSR and the valuable stuff it has for gamers to kind of take their game to a different level than just buying the, you know, official Wizards of the Coast products. And, you know, that video has had a lot of views, and I think it's probably been able to not because of the YouTube channel, which most of the people that subscribe to my YouTube channel are probably already OSR people, but because I, you know, posted it on Twitter and shared it on Twitter on occasions where I thought it would be able to be reached by a different audience. I think it's probably had an effect, right? And so if we get more OSR people posting on Twitter, more OSR people doing stuff on YouTube, because those are, let's face it, as much as I have many issues with the left-wing bias on both of those platforms, and the SJW bias to be more specific, those are the big platforms, right? That's where stuff happens, right? So in a way, if more of the OSR people that were just kind of sitting comfortably in Google Plus now go out and start, you know, they start their own YouTube channel, or they start posting on Twitter, or maybe on Facebook too, although Facebook I've always thought was a bad platform for this sort of thing.
Yeah, most of the time people don't even see what you post.
So what the net result of this, I think, will be that the OSR will be discovered by people who would never have discovered it had Google just continued as a, you know, mostly dead platform.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess we encourage people to find us on MeWe, Minds.com. Steam It could use more role-playing people on it to make a sustainable community there. But yeah, have a look around, see what you can find.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, should we move on?
I think so.
All right, so the next subject of the night, I know that I have been bashing on Matt Mercer quite a bit, but the problem is every time that I think, oh, okay, well, that's it, he does something else that's stupid that needs to be bashed on, right? And in this case, I guess in this the most recent episode of Critical Role, they were having an adventure that involved, I guess, facing the Yuan Ti, which are at this point, a fairly classic D&D and nemesis. And at one point, Mercer describes, as the players reach this temple of the Yuan Ti, he says that the temple is a pyramid that's Aztec-like, right? And a bunch of people jumped on that, of accusing him of, you know, racism and cultural appropriation and all this stuff, which is just nonsensical, of course. But he went and immediately gave this groveling apology for having used the term Aztec-like when describing a temple in his you know, reality show of D&D, and it's so pathetic, right? And the funny thing was that in his apology tweet, you had a couple of things that happened. First, Satine Phoenix, who currently works for Wizards of the Coast but is surprisingly not an SJW, she jumped in and said something along the lines of that he has nothing to apologize for, and she doesn't understand why people would have reacted that way, and defended, you know, that we have to have the freedom of our imagination in how we describe things, and the obvious point that the only way in an RPG where you have where you're working with the theater of the mind to describe stuff is to bring it into context that the players will immediately be able to visualize something, right? And obviously, describing a pyramid style temple as Aztec like makes perfect sense, right? Of course, then some people attacked her for that, right? I think that when Satine was first hired, we talked about it on Inappropriate Characters, and we all know that she's not really somebody who's drunk the Kool-Aid of the SJW ideology. And I was saying that sooner or later, people are going to kind of realize that, and I wonder if there's going to be a backlash against her. And I think that, at least in that comment, there's been a little backlash. And then the second thing that happened in that thread is that you had a large number. I mean, I think it was close to a dozen at least of Mexican gamers who went on and all unanimously said, this doesn't bother us at all. Some of them are saying, no, it makes total sense. Some of them said, it's cool that you use that imagery, that it doesn't offend us. We're happy that this is something that's part of our culture, or part of our history, or whatever you want to say it, that's been presented there. And there were other Latino gamers, myself, of course, but others besides, that were saying the same thing, who might not have been Mexican gamers, but basically it pointed out something that there wasn't, as far as I could see, maybe there was somebody, but I didn't see it. The people who the SJWs were attacking Mercer for this, and therefore the people he apologized to were all white middle-class people, right? He was apologizing to white people while ignoring what the Mexican gamers were telling him, right? And he's refused to acknowledge this, right? But essentially, this was something that white people got outraged for, demanding, an apology on behalf of Mexican gamers, none of whom agreed with the SJWs. And it's sort of just a microcosm of everything that's wrong with SJW ideology.
Well, I think that's every once in a while, and in this case, we should take a page out of the SJW book and tell the white middle class people to just shut up for a minute and sit down and just stop talking.
It's the unbelievable hypocrisy of these people. They constantly tell you, they say, if you're a white man, you don't get to talk, right? You should shut up. You have to listen to Latinos about Latino issues, right? But if Latinos disagree with them, then that goes all out the window, right? Because they want to be speaking for the Latinos, right? And if the Latinos don't agree with what they're saying, then they're bad Latinos, right? And they just don't count. And you should listen to the white SJWs.
Just like that video for the white middle class youth, SJWs protesting the black people at Starbucks. It's like, you've come full circle now. Like, you are now the racist, bigoted, unthinking, unsympathetic assholes that the world needs less of. You are now the problem.
It just makes no sense anyway, because his show is a bit more slick and scripted and edited and whatever, but when you're games mastering or when you're playing at the table, you're constantly improvising. If you have to stop and pass everything you're going to say as part of a description or whatever through your PC filter, the game's just going to grind to a halt. The descriptions are going to be worthless. I mean, what could you say other than Aztec-looking architecture? You could go into a long description like step pyramid and, square exaggerated carvings or whatever. But that's a very long-winded way of saying Aztec-like or Mesoamerican. It doesn't help matters at all. It's just, there's no forgiveness, there's no elasticity to understand the context of the situation, and that you're improvising and it's offhand and you're trying to convey information in as compact and rapid a way as possible. It's just, you have transgressed and must pay. And it's not like apologizing did him any good either.
No. That's what Pundit's been saying, is that all these people, not all, but a lot of these people that have been watching, they're not D&D players. They're not game masters, fellow game masters who can understand and commiserate with the trials and tribulations, the struggles that game masters go through. They're just the spectators, and they have no appreciation for what real game mastering is. And so, yeah, they jumped down those guys' throats for fucking nothing. And it's just so stupid. Yeah, it's just play D&D. Go out there and actually play D&D and try it out. If you're just starting out and you want to be good right away, it's fucking hard. So don't think that you just master it like that and you can complain just because you see someone not even struggle for an instant. Exactly what he said was completely fine. He did nothing wrong whatsoever.
The only thing wrong he did was apologizing.
Well, yeah, exactly. And feel bad and try to make the social justice warriors feel better and try to make them his friends, I guess. Because they're not going to be your friends. Maybe for a minute until they eat you too. And then what do you have?
Yeah, but plus side, Satine did the right thing. So
yeah, she did.
Well, more people back her up because she seems like
she doesn't need anyone to white knight for her. But I did go in and argue a bit.
Yeah, but it is really incredible. I think that if the SJWs really could have their, obviously if they could really, really have their way, people just wouldn't play RPGs because fundamentally these people think that RPGs are fundamentally wrong. They're part of the, white imperialist, misogynist culture or something like that, and they want to just stop it happening. That's really that would be their ultimate success. But I think if they couldn't get that, what they really are wanting to demand is that, at every game table there be a political commissar, like in the old USSR, when the Soviet army was fighting and you'd have the commander, but then you'd have the political commissar attached to the unit. And the commander might not be able to do something if the political commissar said, no, this is contrary to our, to our Soviet agenda, right? And I think that's what they want. They want a DM, and then they want like the political correctness officer at the table telling you how to, what you're not allowed to say if you're a DM, right? Like DMs are a huge problem for them. It's always been that. That's why, the SJW influenced games try to reduce the role of the DM as much as possible. It's because it ties into their absolute psychotic, neurotic obsession with authority and hierarchy, right? That this is, to them, the DM isn't the guy that's helping make the game work. He's like the evil oppressor, and is bound to be wrong. And
so
people like
more powerful authority that takes everybody's agency away, including the game master.
As usual, I wouldn't go quite that far.
Well, I don't know. You saw that in the Pathfinder playtest where it was telling people that even if there isn't anybody at your table who is, who would be offended by something, you have to follow the SJW rules because you can't, as a political act, you can't do something that would be offensive to anybody else anywhere else, right? Especially, the right kind of offensive, right? The kind of offensive they worry about, which is offensive to their SJW ideology, right? So you have to be worried about people who are not at your table, somehow. It's just ridiculous.
That game, Kids with Bikes, you've got to go.
It's my time. I got to go.
All right. No.
Remember, everyone, if you want Venture to be able to stay longer, if you want him to get permission to actually film a full episode with us, then support us on Patreon. The more Patreon we get, the more likely we are to be able to get more time, more Avenger time for him to continue contributing.
That's right.
He nearly made it to the end tonight.
So
we have one more item to talk
about. Yet so far.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
All right.
I was going to say, Kids with Bikes, that new game apparently has pages and pages and pages telling you, you should always moderate for who's at the table and allow them to play the X cards and whatever else. It's just, don't play games if you're that sensitive.
Well, like I said, that's their ultimate goal. The very fact of people getting together to play games without a political commissar to control them is the problem as far as they see it, which is why they encourage stuff like shows like Critical Role to begin with, because they want to have a much smaller group of celebrity people or pseudo celebrity people that they can directly control, to tell them you can't do this, you must do that, and for everybody else to be passive consumers of this SJW propaganda. It's kind of the tragedy of people like Mercer, that they're totally on board with this agenda, but fundamentally they're bound. It's like an aristocrat that supported the French Revolution, right? It doesn't matter. You're still an aristocrat. At the end of the day, sooner or later, when there's space and when there's enough room, and we've killed all the people that were against us to start with, we're going to put you on the guillotine too, because it doesn't matter what else you think or what else you say. You're one of the aristocrats, right? Matt Mercer is fundamentally a straight white male, right? So if as soon as there isn't somebody else for the SJWs to hang, it'll be his turn on the block,
Yeah. I wouldn't go as far as saying that there's a particular agenda or anything. I think it's just emergent that people have these politics and they believe everything is political, and so individually they make these decisions, sometimes for good positive reasons. It's just the effect of them is massively negative. I don't think there needs to be any kind of overarching thing driving it. It's just individuals acting in a way that ends up in this conglomeration of bullshit that we all have to put up with.
There isn't a conspiracy or some shadowy council out there, but there is something overall that's driving it, which is a toxic ideology. It was this ideology.
Oh. Am I going to do that? Oh, there you are. Okay,
Marxist plot to unravel the West, right, through stuff like the Frankfurt School. And that it was originally designed as a weapon in the Cold War, right? It was meant to demoralize and destabilize the West. And now, the Soviet Union is long gone, but it's like, they released a killer android out there, and that android's still killing people for a war that's over, like it's now not really controlled by anyone, but it's become this toxic cancer on academia, and then through academia on culture and media, that just doesn't want to go away, in spite of the fact that it is now provably absolutely unpopular. And this brings us into our final topic of the night, which is that there was an article a study that was released just recently that generated a number of articles. There's an article about it on the Federalist, which is kind of a neocon site, but then also on the Atlantic, which is a kind of a left-wing site. And the study itself was done by a British organization called More in Common, which was an organization that was founded, I guess, after the killing of Joe Cox, a British MP who was murdered during the Brexit vote. So More in Common is definitely not a right-wing organization. It's it was founded basically by Remainers, and I guess you could probably tell people more about that organization than I could.
Well, from what I can gather, so Jo Cox was a Labour MP. She was killed by an unhinged guy who was very pro-Brexit, but that's kind of incidental to the fact that he was off the rails. And it's hard to get firearms in the UK, but he managed to get one, and he killed her because he saw her as a traitor or whatever. The Brexit campaign has divided the UK in much the same way as Trump's election has divided the US. And for this to happen in the UK, it's quite a big deal, because we tend to be reasonably level-headed and slow about social change and things. But for it to get to that point, for a politician to get killed was seen as a really huge thing. I mean, it's a big thing in any country, but for Britain, it's practically unheard of since I think the 1700s for something like that to really happen, other than the RA bombings in the 80s. So this charity, this group, seems to have come together to try and diffuse some of this tension that now exists along all kinds of political and social fault lines in Britain. And so that's their motivation, to try and show that despite our divisions, we're more alike than we are different. Hopefully that's enough of a quick rundown for you.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so this study that they did was not a study of UK, but rather of the United States, where they did polling of 8,000 people with 1-hour interviews and focus groups. And they were trying to look at a variety of issues, but the most significant thing that came out of it was kind of the perspective on SJW politics, of political correctness and that sort of thing. And what they found was, I'm sure, shocking to them, and was pretty much a confirmation of everything that I and other people have been saying, which is that, in fact, almost nobody actually supports SJW ideology, right? In the polling, it turned out that about 8% of Americans are actually supporters of SJW ideology. And on the other hand, you had an average of 80% of Americans are opposed to SJW political correctness. And the very interesting thing about this, that at least to me, the most interesting thing, was that you had among white respondents, white people who were polled, 79% of white people were opposed to SJW politics. But if you looked at the Black, Hispanic, Asian, and American Indians that were polled, all of them had higher percentages of opposition to SJW ideology, right? So there were actually more white people that had milder views on SJW ideology than the minority groups, right? Like 87% of Hispanics are opposed to SJW ideology, and 82% of Asians, and I don't remember exactly what percentage of African Americans, but it was very clear that not only did the vast majority have an opposition, but there wasn't what, I'm sure SJWs would have at least wanted to believe, which was that the majority opposed to left-wing, ultra-progressive SJW political correctness were going to be white people. No, there are more non-white people who hate these guys than there are white people who hate these guys. And the other interest, sorry.
I was going to say, I bet it's because it's so patronizing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the other very interesting detail is that out of the people who were polled that were in favor of SJW ideology, the vast, vast majority of them were white, and almost the entirety of them were from what you would call the middle class and were college educated, right? So this absolutely confirms in every sense that the SJW ideology is a product of the middle class, and it's a product of the rot in Western academia, of this Marxist garbage that has infested every level of academia. It came out coincidentally at the same time as this scandal came out of the grievance studies scandal, where a trio of basically moderate left academics made a number of unbelievably ridiculous papers, like intentional hoax papers, that they sent out and got like 30 of them published in peer-reviewed journals, including one that was posted to a major feminist journal, where the person that made that one just quoted Mein Kampf and changed Jews to like white males or stuff like that, right? Like, so it was just the most blatantly ridiculous articles, and they were embraced by these people as proof of, like, without any sources, without any academic rigor. So it showed just what a joke mostly the humanities, but I mean, we've seen similar things posted even to science journals, that Western academia is in ruins because of these people, right? So it's really amazing to me. But between these two results, right, between the grievance studies fraud and this new study, it's shown that SJWs are despised. They're absolutely universally despised, and that they have no academic rigor behind what they're doing, and they have no popular support behind what they're doing. And their support among minorities is even less than their support among white people.
Yeah, it's because they're patronizing, because they catastrophize everything. Yeah, there is not a significant number of people in the West anymore, I don't think, who are genuinely racist or genuinely sexist or whatever. But then these people, the social justice warriors, and to me, the warrior indicates a degree of extremism and irrationality. There's nothing wrong with social justice. There's something wrong with social justice warriors. You know, that's the difference. But yeah, like I say, they catastrophize everything. You look at the example we were just talking about with Aztec-style architecture. That isn't something anyone should be making a fuss about. It's not something that can be said to be racist. It's not meaningfully any kind of cultural appropriation. And yet they upbraid this guy for it, and he apologizes for it. It doesn't make any sense. It's that kind of killjoy behavior and that patronizing, even dare I say it, colonial attitude towards, you know, these poor little brown people who don't know enough to stand up for themselves. It's that makes them hated. They don't seem to understand that so many of these battles have essentially already been won, and then they hyperfixate on these tiny, meaningless things. It's just,
Yeah, it's absolutely astounding. But the interesting thing at the same time now, like what I'm seeing as recently between, you know, this this grievance studies hoax, intentional hoax that was meant to expose these people, and this study that got, you know, coverage not just from right-wing sites but from moderate left-wing sites, and the recent firing of a number of SJWs who had made, you know, absolutely hateful, you know, virulent attacks on people, including the, you know, their own customers. All of that stuff is, I think, new. We would not have seen this a year and a half or 2 years ago, right? No. What we're seeing is a very serious backlash against this SJW ideology that is beginning to emerge, not just among, you know, let's say among the right wing, which have always opposed them, but into the mainstream. I think it's a real sign of the change that is happening now, and it ties in also to the powerful reaction that happened against you know, the Democrat tactics during the Kavanaugh hearings. That I think the Democrats went in thinking that this was going to be kind of a slam dunk, that they were going to use this kind of, you know, the feminist hysteria, the Me Too and all of that, and that they were going to sink Kavanaugh's nomination, and that they were going to get widespread support for this, and it was going to help them in the midterms. And in fact, all of the opposite happened, right? Kavanaugh was confirmed because Republicans stood strong, because they realized that they didn't have to be afraid of these people anymore. The media, except for, you know, the elite, you know, establishment media like CNN and MSNBC, who are also dying in the ratings. In other areas of media, there was strong criticism of the Democrats. There was a public backlash against the Democrats, and now it looks like in polling, like the Democrats' chances of retaking the House or the Senate are rapidly disappearing. Right, that there was a complete turn against them because of what they did. So we're seeing SJW still doing the same old tactics, but suddenly it's not working for them in any way, right?
Yeah, but they're not learning. I mean, as someone on the left, that's upsetting to me that they're not learning. That they went after Kavanaugh on the basis of 30, 35-year-old hearsay was frustrating, because there's a ton of stuff in his record to go after in regard to his judgments and his support for the Patriot Act and his support for more authoritarian powers for the president, things like that. There was plenty of red meat to go after there that may have even played better to the Republican base, to the more libertarian side of the Republicans.
Sure. And
they just ignored it. And it's horribly frustrating and annoying to see that kind of thing going on, and similar things going on here with the Labour Party over here. But the SJWs, they just don't seem to be learning. Like Chuck Wendig, he's been hoisted by his own petard, and yet he's learned absolutely nothing from it. You know, he called for people to be fired for things they said on Twitter. He celebrated Roseanne Barr being fired from her show, all of this stuff. Now, he's been fired for exactly the same behavior, but doesn't seem to comprehend that this is a situation that he has helped create.
Yeah, he called for people to be put through a wood chipper. But I think the grievance studies hoax, one of the things that it shows is just how intellectually lazy the SJW left really is, right? Like they're terrible debaters, which is why they don't want to debate. They just want to censor. And they really don't believe in any kind of intellectual rigor. And they always want to go for the cheapest shot they can because they think that that's, because for a while that really worked for them, because there was a time when calling someone a racist, when racist really meant something, when we, there are racists in the world, and we all agreed that racism is a terrible thing, and we still do. But the problem is now they decide to just call everybody a racist, and so now that word means nothing, right? So they called,
that used to be a really powerful thing to say. I would take it seriously back, I don't know, 2010, 2012, when someone called someone a racist. I would take that seriously. Now, I'm instantly, okay, what did they actually say? What did they actually do? Is this the truth? Or if it's an incident that's gone viral, I want to go and see the original footage and be sure that I know what's actually happened. I don't trust them.
Yeah, aside from maybe their destruction of the intellectual foundations of the West, probably the worst thing that they have done, the most damaging thing that they have done to our society, is that they've made meaningless a bunch of terms that once were really important terms to have, because it clearly marked somebody as doing wrong. And now you can't just accept when someone uses those terms that person's done anything wrong at all, because it's been used falsely so often, right?
Yeah,
that's unbelievably damaging.
I'm on quite a lot of author lists and things because I do dabble, and watching quite a lot of big name authors react to what happened to Chuck Wendig. They're instantly throwing about terms like Nazis to justify people that they think should be censored, and there's just no self-awareness. It is. It's actually really distressing because they have completely delegitimized left-wing thought by superimposing all this bullshit on top of it.
Yeah. Well, for me, the thing that gives me a lot of hope in all this is, like I said, that now there's very clearly a greater backlash against this happening even in the mainstream. I think that you could kind of say that the second half of this year is where we've really come around the bend, right? We've not just been able to hold against them, but now we're gaining ground, and that's a really good thing, because it means that I think that's only going to gain more momentum and accelerate. And I think you're absolutely right that the SJWs themselves are learning nothing, and I think that's great, because it means that they're just going to keep doubling down and saying more stupid things, and that will only increase the momentum against them, right? It will only create more and more of a backlash until nobody takes them seriously anymore in any way, and they lose all credibility. And hopefully at that point, we will return to a kind of sanity, and more people will say, you know what, maybe free speech is a really good idea, and maybe not listening to totalitarian shitheads is a really good idea.
It's taken longer to swing around, though, and it has been a lot more vicious than the last height of PC during the 90s. I think that must be down to the internet and social media.
I think so, but it was also that, they've gone through a very long and slow campaign, because they learned from what happened in the 90s. And Christina Hoff Sommers, who's an excellent feminist writer, but not the SJW kind of feminist, she has a saying about this, right? Was that in the first PC war in the 90s, the political correctness crowd lost every battle and won every tenure track, right? So they in public opinion, they were just absolutely rejected. But the people who were making these ridiculous statements in the early 90s all ended up getting influential positions in academia. And then they spent the next 20 years slowly and increasingly indoctrinating young people into SJW ideology, and kind of twisting them around into this cult of mentality, so that they would become more and more accepting of these incredibly ridiculous things, right? That they at first they thought they could just hammer this into society, but then they realized they couldn't. And so what they worked on was this kind of long game strategy of gradually changing the views of the upper middle class elite, and then hopefully using that. This was their plan, and it worked well for them for a while. Using that to create legislative and social control changes in society that they hoped would increasingly make people vulnerable to indoctrination in their ideology. And it went smashingly until a few of us started fighting back and realizing their game, and began using some of that same sort of tactic to undo what they were doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be repeating myself. I don't quite go as far as you do in thinking it's orchestrated or whatever. I just think it's the natural emergent result of individual actions. But yeah, it does seem to have contracted into the institutions and then re-emerged from it. I think that's actually why we saw it in tabletop gaming earlier, because RPGs have always been associated with universities and and so forth. So that's why I think we felt the sting a little bit earlier than other people.
Another thing that did that in RPGs is that there were certain places that much more quickly became strongholds of that ideology, right? Like geographical places I'm talking about, which was especially the major cities that already had a large population of people who were inclined to kind of the left-wing politics of the 1960s, and that the younger generation of those people were more apt to be indoctrinated into this mentality, right? So the big change in that in RPGs largely coincided with the moment where the major RPG industry shifted from Middle America, from Wisconsin over to Seattle, which was one of these big strongholds, right? Seattle had quickly become, like the left coast in general, had become one of the strongholds of that sort of thinking. And a lot of these ideas that later spread to all the other universities started in the California and the Pacific Coast universities, right? It really started, down in Berkeley and stuff like that, and moved its way along to other places, but not at an even pace, right? It caught on much more quickly in that kind of triangle of Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco,
I just want to get back to a place where people can do their own thing and it's nobody else's business. Maybe you make fun of each other. That's a far healthier way to deal with it all.
Yeah. Well, you talked about how the internet probably has helped this problem emerge. And in a way, the internet, much like beer, is both the cause and the solution to most problems, it's true that I don't think that SJWs could have been nearly as successful were it not for the internet and social media, especially. But it's also going to be their undoing because they can't control it. If they could control the internet, or if it hadn't been for the internet, and all you had was stuff like the mainstream media, if you had, like television was still the central medium of transmitting information for people, then all they would have had to do is control, as they did, all of the major, television stations and the production of TV shows, and stuff like that. If they could infiltrate, Hollywood and the large news channels, then they would control all media. They would control all the way that information is transmitted. But they can't do that on the internet. So you had, from the start, there was the alternative media of both kind of like individual, amateur journalists, and also libertarian and cultural libertarian websites that fought against them. And of course, what caused the delay is just that we were playing catch up, right? And we were learning how to fight, because for a long time you had people that were libertarians or people on the right or moderate leftists, for that matter, who were even when they realized the tactics that the SJWs used, they were like, well, we can't lower ourselves to use that same kind of tactic against them. We have to maintain our own dignity, and we'd rather take the high road and end up getting our asses kicked. So a number of us started saying, no, that's not how you win. You have to stop them by turning their own ability to manipulate language, turning their own ability to manipulate media against them. And I know that some people think that that's kind of like uncouth or whatever, but that's the way to stop them. You have to, if you're fighting a war and the other side is fighting dirty, you have to fight dirty back.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to get to bed in a sec, so we should probably wrap. Is there anything you've got new to advertise or pimp or shill or whatever else?
No, I'm just continuing with my RPG Pundit Presents products. I think pretty soon we're going to start working on doing an anthology of some of those issues. We're going to put them together. I got to remember to talk to my publisher about that to get that going. So in the future, you'll be able to get an anthology volume. But for the moment, every week, RPG Pundit presents you a new small source book or adventure related to usually either medieval authentic fantasy role-playing or gonzo OSR fantasy role-playing. So be sure to check that out. And at the same time, be sure to check out our individual channels, my channel, the RPG Pundit, and Grim and Venger's channels. And absolutely support us on Patreon if you want us to be able to do this more often, if you want us to be able to have Venger here until the end of the show. Please give us some of your Patreon support. We appreciate everyone who has supported us on Patreon. We're very thankful for that. And it helps us be able to be motivated to continue doing this. And if we get up to higher levels of support, we will be doing this more often. So if you like this, then be sure to back us up on Patreon.
Yep, and encourage other people to subscribe. We have managed to claim the name Inappropriate Characters for the YouTube channel now. We've grown to that extent. We've got pretty good numbers, pretty good viewers. We need 1,000 subscribers to monetize the channel. So if you can pimp us out anywhere, that would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, share this video everywhere. Share it even on MeWe. Share it on MeWe. What the hell? But share it on
worst that could happen?
Facebook and on Google Plus while it's still here and everywhere else. Make sure that people that don't know that we're here see it, and then maybe they'll subscribe too, and that's how we keep growing.
Yeah, and if you've got any tips or anything you want us to cover, do let us know in the comments. But I guess that's it for tonight. Good night, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Currently smoking Raleigh Hawkbill with Image, Virginia.
Good night.